time, I expect. So let's tell you about Gary. First, as well as being a generous supporter with his time, his energy, and his money of ASSAP over these years, Gary is currently working as a program manager, specializing in data analytics with the US Department of the Treasury. He's worked in over 15 countries and a long career with IBM, and is proud to hold US, UK, and Australian citizenships. A long-time member of ASSAP, Gary's edited the journal's e-journal, Society's e-journal, for several years, which is what we were just talking about, and has assembled an extensive library on the paranormal. So that was recorded by Claire. Thank you to Claire for her contributions. She's currently in Antigua. And as I said, I might get to go there if we put the membership up. Gary will tonight be speaking to us on the subject of, and this sounds fascinating, narrative research from qualitative to quantitative analysis. So Gary, without further ado, after that epic introduction, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that very thorough introduction.
Can everyone hear you okay?
I appreciate it.
Good. Okay.
Can you hear me? And
I am struggling.
Can you see the slide? You are struggling? Okay, can you hear me better now? Am I loud enough?
Can people hear okay?
He's very quiet, but I'm sure that it will be fine.
Hang on, let's just see. Can we use your hands up or hands down token, little icon things on the thing? Can anyone hear okay? Has anyone got a problem with the hearing, the volume? Okay, we're all okay.
Up on my PC, and it's okay now. I think
Thank you very much.
people just need to turn the volume up higher than usual.
Okay.
Yeah, what I
Thank
might
you,
suggest is just put yourself on mute, which will eliminate the background sound, and I will certainly have time at the end for questions. So. Thanks very much, CJ. As discussed, I really want to talk about the bringing research of the paranormal into the 21st century by going from qualitative data to quantitative analysis. The next slide. All right, so we'll take a look at the problem. I've got a recommended, to discuss the approach, and then I've got some recommendations. So what is the problem? Well, part of the problem is if you ask, have people seen a ghost? The answer in many cases is yes. This is from Charlotte, North Carolina. But for thousands of years and in multiple locations, you could ask and people would say yes. Our attendance at this meeting reflects our interest in the paranormal. And so you would think after all of this time and all of this information, we would know if there were such things as ghosts. However, all those stories we tend to be disparaged. In fact, when I attended the ASSAP training, I was, quite clearly brought over to me that people's memories are not always reliable, that the stories are not accurate, and that sometimes witnesses just make things up. Right? So despite all of this, we still don't know if there are ghosts. And what does that mean? The burden of proof for this extraordinary claim has yet to be met. Now, 100 years ago, people like Harry Houdini sought to prove whether or not the paranormal is true, but is best known for breaking up seances, for uncovering false psychics. And that was earlier. And then, of course, you had the late James Randi and his $1 million prize if anybody could demonstrate the supernatural under scientific conditions. All of this accompanied by, over the last several decades, television and films aimed at collecting data using a variety of instruments, all of which collect data, but data of what remains debatable. And so at this point in time, we still don't have an answer. In fact, our organization is called the Association for the Scientific Study. of anomalous phenomena. We too are hunting for evidence. And when we say we're hunting for evidence, and when most people talk about hunting for evidence, they really are talking about quantitative data. And we want to be able to weigh, measure, or take a temperature or change it in voltage or something that clearly demonstrates that something supernatural has occurred and that it's repeatable. And yet, there's plenty of information out there. This is an example of a book on Dorset. There are 50 stories in this book. I have at least stories from 60 books similar to this from 60 cities. That means in my basement alone, I have 3,000 stories of the paranormal. And this is a tiny drop in the bucket of what's available on the internet and in other libraries. And I think, in part, we make a mistake when we put these stories aside, because as it says here from a research paper, right, transforming transcripts into stories really are reality. Yes, there are issues with them, but it is a primary source of data. That's why interviews are so important. And so, and really, so what we need to start thinking about is, how do we take this primary source of data, all of this information, and better make use of it? In other words, is there gold in them dar hills? I think there is. So what approach am I recommending? It's something called quantitative narrative analysis, and this is a book by Franzosky, who is an excellent book if you're interested in this. Right, and what the methodology really revolves around is are semantic triplets. Right, you take a story and you break it down into its little components, where a subject, there's something to an object. Now that sounds, fairly, counterintuitive, because what does that do? But at the end of it, where does that leave you? But what leaves you is a series of data points that can then be compared. Right? You can then see who are the key players in the story. You can capture relationships, and you can eventually generate a network. So this is an example from a famous ghost story, not a true one, right? It's Shakespeare, and it's not Shakespeare that loved to appear on the stage. But at the beginning of the famous ghost scene, right, the ghost appears to Hamlet, ghost appears Horatio, Hamlet speaks to Ghost, Ghost beckons Hamlet, Hamlet follows Ghost, Hamlet speaks Ghost, and it goes on and on. These are semantic triplets, breaking out this particular narrative into bits of data that can then be analyzed and compared in order to develop a network map. Now, they use these network maps, for example, to decide who wrote a piece of literature. I think similar maps have been used to demonstrate that the Earl of Oxford wrote some of Shakespeare's plays, or to demonstrate that Shakespeare actually wrote some of Shakespeare's plays. But it can do far more than that. My idea would be to focus on that, because this is a very old and famous picture, but understanding the language is so critical, and we just don't do it yet in this particular field, right? And if you don't get it right, then you don't get the right results. So, for example, this is a page full of words. What do these words have in common? Well, they're actually words that are used to describe a ghost. Phantasm, phantom, spirit, on and on. In fact, there's more. I ran out of space. But this lack of clarity gets in the way of research and gets in the way of developing that those type of data points, those semantic triplets. So where do we go? My recommendation is we need to start. Yeah, go ahead. Is we need to start coming up with basically the first step, which is developing a coding scheme or a standard that would consist of classes of paranormal activity. In this case, I'm listing ghost, UFO, UAP, cryptid, side. The list could go on. And within that, you would have categories. See, did they smell? Did you hear? Where was the ghost? What was the location? What the environment was? The weather? Were there witnesses? And again, on and on. Now, that sounds pretty simple, but if you saw this picture, you would say, this is a house. And it is. It's an attached house. And this is a semi-attached house. But what is this? Carbon flat? Barbican? And does it fall into the same category as these flats in the city of Bath? Or are they two separate categories? Is this a palace? Or is it a church? Because the Archbishop of Canterbury lives here and holds services, or is it a castle? It's called Lambeth Castle. Is this an office building or a residence? This is Elsinore Castle. It doesn't look like a castle to me. It looks more like a palace, but again, the question of category. Of course, you have Buckingham Palace. Yes, the king lives there, but it's also a place where ceremonies are held. So getting this right is actually a lot of work, but it's the key. If we're going to develop these semantic triplets and then be able to match data to it, we have to get the balance between seeing the forest and seeing the trees right. And that does take work. But I think at the end, it'll be worthwhile. Because when you develop these categories, you can then assign individual attributes. Now, this is not a paranormal set, but you can see, like the attributes on the first column, then as you go across, various characteristics of those attributes. By defining this set, we can restrict the content that we're putting into our systems and develop, and so we can begin seeing if there are relationships. And so I tossed up as an example, if you have a class called Ghost and something called Level of Awareness, you might say attribute is the ghost unaware of their surroundings. There's that there are all those ghosts that seem to walk belly up through the flooring because the height of the floor has changed. Are they aware but unresponsive to outside noises or attempts to interact? Right, so they go through modern doors. They seem to avoid furniture, but you can't interact with them. Or do they respond? Well, finally, sorry, I got a bit of a cold. The interactive. Not saying this is what this particular set of attributes and values should be, but it gives you an idea of what would be involved. And then the question becomes, what do you do with this information? For that, for better or worse, you need tools. First, you need a computer system to host them on. Then you need a relationship, some sort of relational database. And finally, you need qualitative research software to do that semantic mapping. And the second one is actually free, but the first and the third tend not to be. So I'm glad Sunday a meeting, at the AGM, maybe we can table, some money for this. Once you have all of that, then the question becomes, what content are you going to put into the system? You have online content, you have books, magazines, transcripts. I'm sure the SPR and ASSAP have between them hundreds, if not thousands, of interviews with people who have experienced the paranormal. You'd have to review that content and decide what you were going to put in, particularly if you're going to have a pilot. That's deciding on a sample, random sample, or some methodology we're looking at. Again, there's work to be done here. And then you get to the hard bits. Having done that, you have to actually get this material into the system. Somebody has to sit down and code it, or you have to scan it in. And but scanning it in, for those of you like myself have experienced it, comes with its own downside. Sometimes you have to spend more time fixing things that the scan had incorrect than it would have been to enter it in the first place. But, and remember that when you're reading the story, you have your standards, which you've developed, that you want to utilize when you're entering the data. The rules. What is a house? What is a dining room? What is a parlor? All of these things should be defined and agreed. And so stories might have to be adjusted, or algorithms to take the original language and map it to a standard would have to be developed. And then you'd want to add metadata. The story is fine, but it's probably not adequate. There are the factors, very often outside the story. For example, what is the education of the witnesses, their gender, their age? What are they employed at? What about the building, the location? Inside or outside? Stairwell or parlor? Bedroom, attic? What is the history of the site? What are things made out of? What was the weather? All of that's important because in part, we don't know what they're actually looking for. Assuming that these stories that reflect a real event, that they're all not just made up. And if we have thousands of them, I find that unlikely. Then what is the common thread? Metadata will help with that. And so one of the constraints you might have on choosing content is choosing content for which you can get metadata, where you know the witnesses, you know the location, you know dates, so you can check on weather and other things, and put it into the system and attach it to the data record. Here's an example. Winston Churchill, great prime minister, and he spoke to ghosts. He apparently spoke to the ghost of his father. He was not impressed by him, and he saw the ghost of Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln bedroom in the White House. Now, this is a case where there's an awful lot of metadata we would have on this particular event. We know dates, we know weather, we know all about Churchill. And and so we could take this, and you would create these semantic triplets. Might say Churchill saw ghost. Churchill ghost. If those are the rules, so do we use the term father? Because you want to know what the relationship is between the person who saw the ghost and the ghost itself. That itself might be metadata. Is there more of a tendency to see people that you're related to than not? Does that connection influence the likelihood of a supernatural event? Having chosen your sample, having developed your standards, having put all that in, depending how you put the data in, you end up at the perhaps most tedious yet most important phase, which is your data cleaning or cleansing. When you go through, we talked about adding a lot of metadata, you actually go through and you move things you don't need. You might find there were duplicates. A lot of these books have the same story presented slightly differently. And remove those. There might be errors. You're not actually using the standard term that we agreed. There might be data that ended up missing, all sorts of unusual events that you want to get rid of because they're less likely to be valid. At the end of it, you have big data, right? You have all of your semantic data coming in, all of your metadata coming in. Sorry. And at that point, coming to standards, you're in a position to start doing metadata analysis, data analysis, to really see what the connections are. What's the common threads that are uniting all of these events, these stories? As it turned out that a Clark the 33-year-old male Clark living in a Victorian house is more likely to see a ghost than other types of people. Is that right? I have no idea if that's true, by the way, but it's the kind of things this could tell you. Or is it more likely that you'll see a ghost at night when there has been electrical storm during the day? I mean, certainly that seems to be true if you look in the storybooks. But is it true in real life? Yeah. This is the type of thing, analysis that would tell us that. And then you would be able to start producing charts, visualizations that would provide explanations that would show what's more likely, what's not likely, what events are related to other events. And with that information, we may be in a position to actually, if not duplicate, at least to possibly predict the likelihood of events occurring under certain conditions. So what am I recommending? I'm recommending that over the next 12 months, and maybe this is one of these opportunities for somebody that's being put in charge of a program, that ASSAP assemble a program team to develop a project proposal and a cost estimate for some sort of a pilot. We need a research lead, you want a project manager, there'd have to be somebody to examine schemas and content, data quality, all trying to build a project proposal that would contain a description of how the work would proceed, a schedule, and a cost. Now, once that has been developed and approved, maybe at next year's AGM, we would begin searching for a research partner to assist, not just with funding, but with the actual work. Perhaps university, or maybe the SPR, or grants, or ultimately crowdsourcing or crowdfunding. And with that, I seem to have reached the end. I'm happy to go back. I do apologize, it seemed fairly quick. I'll open it up for questions.
Gary, thank you very much. Let me just see if I can find the questions for you now.
Okay, shall I start chatting while we do?
Yes, please.
Hello there. Thank you very much, and I think that's a very sensible proposal. Let's just go back and run through a little bit of history in the area. There's a paper on the web called, on my blog actually is where I put it, but it was in the old ASSAP journal long ago, called "Why Everything You Think You Know About Ghosts Is Probably Wrong." And in that, I look at my attempts to try and bring a quantitative approach to analysing hauntings over a long time. The real father of all this in terms of data collection was the 1894 SPR Census of Hallucinations, where they sent out 40 collectors with a set questionnaire, administered a survey. There are flaws with it, which led to certain, I mean, when you look at the way they asked some of the questions, there are definitely inherent ideological assumptions which led to some of their results, I believe. But the 40 collectors did an amazing job, and they ended up with it's about 1,000. It was 9.8% anyway. 9.8% of the respondents said yes to having had an experience of the type, which was very carefully defined, which they termed as ghostly. And that data was then subjected to analysis. There was no actual bottom-up analytical methods at the time. And in fact, a lot of what we now consider to be qualitative analysis is first seen in Myers, Podmore, Mrs. Sidgwick, and the others' attempts to try and make sense of that data. And they did a much better job on the qualitative than they did on the quantitative when they were trying to work out the chances of someone dying. I nearly pulled my hair out at some of the assumptions they make. But that 1894 paper then went on to influence a whole tradition of psychical researchers. We have Tyrrell's book, Apparitions, 1948, in which he tries to use the data from those first-hand experiences, and he tries to use that data to determine what the underlying rules of ghosts are. And I think that's a brilliant idea. And then you've got Celia Green and Charles, I've forgotten his surname. Oh, that's so embarrassing. But Celia and Charles over at Oxford, they did a survey in 1970. And Donald J. West did one in 48, one in 56, one in 1970 something, and one in 1990. So all these surveys had the same basic idea of collecting data that could then be subjected to proper rigorous analysis, and which would tell us something about the actual nature of the experience from first-hand witnesses. There was another attempt, though, by Horan and Langer. I'm not sure how you say his name. I mean, I guess it's Langer. Try to pronounce it the Danish way. And Horan and Langer did a paper in the Journal of Nervous Disease, I think it was, in about 96. And they took their material from Arthur Myers. And I thought they meant Arthur Myers, the elder brother of F.W., who died. He was a doctor who died in 1894 while they were compiling the report on the census of apparitions. But no, it turns out he wrote a series of books called America's Haunted Hotels or something similar. And the amusing thing about them is that he's taken the accounts from the people who own the tourist attractions, and he's taken their accounts of what people told them they experienced in various rooms, and he's written them up in a manner that makes them exciting and interesting. So it's a sort of third-hand description of the data. And their description of the attributes of hauntings bear no resemblance whatsoever to the kind of core phenomena that had been recorded in the direct census of hallucinations. But I think that comes down to the different way in which the stories are presented secondhand in fiction. And that takes us through to 2008, when I created a glossary of hauntings. And at some point on that time, I discovered a wonderful book from 1979 by Gordon Cornell called Poltergeists. And chapter 5 of that, called The Ghost on the Computer, all they did was they took 500 poltergeist cases from across history and across the centuries and across different continents. They broke them down into factors and decided that there were 68, for example, I think it was 68 main attributes. There might be over 100 total, but there are 68 which are common across a large number of cases. They created let's say it's 68. So they create a 68-dimensional grid mathematically and perform a cluster analysis, essentially, to see if there are groupings which are different between a ghost case and a poltergeist case. And that 1979 book inspired me to try the same thing again, which I did with my then girlfriend, well, still is my girlfriend, Becky Smith, in 2008 when we first got together. It's a case of, hey, chick, do you fancy analysing some ghosts using a computer? And she was like, yeah, sure, why not? So we got together and we started doing this stuff, and we had a look at it. And then she said, actually, this needs to be done on a larger scale. So she spent the next 5 years doing her PhD, doing a small-scale replication of the census of hallucinations using the same methodology of recruiting people and doing proper. And she ended up with 240 cases. So she probably interviewed about 2,000 people, got 240 cases, which she stripped down by attributes, which were attributes of the location, attributes of the recipient, such as their education, their age, and attributes of the apparition. And from those, we then used a relational database, and I took out a license for a year for a very sophisticated piece of software. And we programmed it to let the AI run and find out what was going on. And at the end of that time, it was Becky's research. I mean, I just managed to turn the computer on for her, basically. She called me in and she said, it's been running for 3 hours, and this was on a really fast computer, and it's found a very, very strong correlation. And I was like really excited. I said, really? And she said, yeah, there's something, it's absolutely, it's absolutely picking this up. And I'm not sure what it is, but I can see that it's coming up with something. There's something very profound it's found. And then it printed it out. And what it said was that people who had the attribute pregnant and who perceived ghosts had the gender women. And the computer thought that this was important and told us it because it was at that point. I mean, it might not be the case nowadays. Gender has changed or gender expression has changed. But at the time, and we spat for 3.5 hours wondering what it was going to tell us. And it told us that women had babies, which we weren't overly. Anyway, we then changed the parameters and made it a bit fuzzier. And we kept going, and all of the stuff Becky found is in her PhD, which was published. In fact, she did her Viva Voce on Halloween 2013, and she's treasurer of ASSAP. So most of you only come across her when you're dealing with your membership fees. But if you actually ask her, she's got a huge amount of data that's stored on the computer. And because we learned the limitations, well, she learned the limitations of the data, I actually had noticed in the 2008 study something else, which was when you ask people to recount experiences, one thing the SPR had noticed in 1894 was that they talk about things that happened to them recently. But the more you ask them, the more they'll phone you up afterwards and say, oh, and also, oh, yes, but I forgot to tell you about this. But the interesting bit is that if you plot them as over time, almost all of the experience has happened in the last 6 weeks or 6 months. And when you get to 20 years, now, when you adjust for age, because obviously people who are 18 aren't going to be having experiences 20 years ago, it's still a good pattern. And it seems that people are only reporting experiences that happen quite recently. So there's one of two things happening. Either this city is heading for a disaster of biblical proportion. I mean, real wrath of God stuff. I mean, cats and dogs living together. And the PKA meters are going off the scale because we are approaching the end times. And in fact, there are ghosts everywhere. Or we forget these experiences. We rationalize them and they become less important to us. And it's less likely that we will report something that occurred 10 years ago than something that occurred 6 weeks ago. So I published a paper in the 2010 ASSAP journal on that idea, and Becky found it was borne out quite strongly in her data as well. So there is some stuff we've already discovered. We have an existing database. We have an existing body of interviews and a format. It's not perfect. There's lots of ways it could be improved. It definitely deserves doing. I think there's a very strong difference we discovered between 3 different data sets that Becky's collected. I had nothing to do with 2 of them. One of them was material she collected from ghost stories to test against from accounts of true ghost experiences, such as, I don't know, Scottish ghosts. There you go, a book like this. If you take down and break this down, because of the author's choices and the editorial choices about what to include and what not to, what you're actually getting is a cross-section of their personal belief about what ghosts are or what will sell or what's an interesting story, which is very different to perhaps what actual first-hand accounts are. If you ask people who aren't particularly interested in ghosts but give you first-hand accounts, there is some crossover between those stories, though, and these stories. But there's almost no crossover at all with the third group, which was she studied she found a document from a book, the Station Hotel in Dudley, called the Spook Book, where the ghost hunters who go there and have had experiences were recording their experiences. So she did exactly the same. She broke it down. She broke it down using discourse analysis into a bunch of ideas and principles. She created a semantic map, and she found that the phenomena that ghost hunters describe as being representative of a haunting has very little resemblance to the phenomena that is described by people who think they've experienced a ghost. So ghost hunters are looking for a different class of phenomena, different types of phenomena to what actually happens in a classical haunting. And the last thing we did was we did a statistical analysis. Well, Becky did it. She just came and showed me the results because I couldn't understand the maths even if I tried, and it wasn't my PhD, but I was obviously fascinated by it. And what she showed was that the factors remain consistent from 1894 through to the present day. In almost every respect, the actual experience doesn't change of the apparitional experience. And that's really interesting because the cultural gap between 1894 and what's happening nowadays is vast because of the influence of Hollywood, etc. So that's my incredibly dull thoughts on the subject of qualitative research. I'm sorry to witter on, Gary. I don't know how much of this you were aware of, but this is what we've been doing over the last few years. And so I'm absolutely up for funding it. And I think it'd be a brilliantly good project.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm afraid I wasn't too far across. I did do some searches on the internet while I was putting it together. I do think there's something to be said for, I guess it's almost like the wisdom of the crowds, right? Where we revisit data and then break it down again into basically its fundamentals, and then hopefully not coming up with the same importance of pregnant women. We let the computer do its stuff, look, I think it would be great, bringing in some of the material from the 19th century all the way up. It would, right as you say, there should be the ghost phenomena should be independent, if it's real, of external changes. We may interpret it differently, but the actual phenomena should be above changes in society. It's a bit like seeing angels in the Middle Ages, seeing UFOs today.
Yeah, absolutely. Same kind of. The thing is, though, that the 1894 census doesn't ask about physical phenomena. It actually completely avoids the question of physical phenomena. And yet physical phenomena are very important in a large number of cases. So it's because Myers and Gurney had developed a telepathic hypothesis and believed that because ghosts were mental projections that were transmitted by telepathy, there could not be any physical environmental change. So their underlying assumptions, even though they were engaging in developing what became one of the great, really early examples, 1894 of bottom-up research, grounded research as we call it now, they actually were still misled by theoretical assumptions. And I don't know how we can avoid that. Using a computer, I guess, is one way. Don't you think that there'll be so many factors involved, though, that it will make it almost impossible to find any meaningful patterns in the data? I don't know. I don't deal with this kind of sophisticated stuff.
I don't think so. I think part of the challenge would be to define the scope of the data you consider important.
Yeah.
I think if it's well defined, my gut tells me, and maybe that's again one of the assumptions, that that these phenomena have something to do with the witness, the location, I would think that's it's one those are like the key factors, and that there's something about those two things that create environments which lead to ghosts.
One of the things Becky did was she excluded edge of sleep, and if you were in bed at the time, it didn't count. The experience, she only included ones where you were to try and not involve edge of dream experiences, hypnagogic and hypnopompic. So she took out anywhere where the percipient was in bed. But the result of that was that you would have thought that there would be, you know, that would take out a large number of nighttime cases. And sure enough, it did. But even if you don't exclude them, one of the things the computer did notice is that they were actually on a flat distribution throughout time of day. So there was no particular time, even 3 o'clock in the morning, once you adjusted for the likelihood of people being awake using standard statistical measures. It was, you know, it wasn't that ghosts occurred at night. Ghosts were as likely to be seen in the day as they were at night. And I found that really interesting.
I'm not surprised by that. I think that was also mentioned as part of the ASSAP training effect. These ghost hunters bumbling around buildings in the dark. It's, you know, it makes for great TV, but not really necessary.
Yeah.
You know, but that if this is a real phenomenon, then there must be some thread, some pattern that exists. And finally, at this point in time, I think we have the technology to unlock it. The question now, it's really a question of working out exactly what criteria we want to focus on, like what metadata is important, and I do think breaking these stories down, you know, into their little components in order to look for patterns that up until now, the likelihood is we just miss it. Right?
Yeah,
as you
absolutely.
say, people write these things up. They make great narratives, but you know, but the goal is to get behind that and get to the very basics of the story. A bit like I did in the example out of Shakespeare.
One of the things that we found, she hasn't published yet, but I've got no objection. Becky will share the data with anyone who asks. But one of the things that Becky found was that there was very little correlation between temperature drops and apparitional experience. Now that surprised me, because that was something that we strongly believe would be associated, but actually it wasn't associated. There was no, you know, it was below chance expectation. And when we look back at 1894, we found it was the same then. Yet when Tyrrell reports the results from 1894 in his 1948 book, he, on 2 or 3 occasions, misrepresents what was actually reported in the 1894 census. One of the really interesting things which we could do if we could collaborate with the SPR is to get access to the 1894 original data and re-enter it. And I think that would be worth investing in. I would be absolutely up for spending money on having that done. What kind of software would you suggest running? I'm trying to remember what Becky used, but because we just paid for license.
I actually give me a second. I actually have something installed on my machine. And there's a product called NVivo. Is one of them?
Yes, NVivo 7 was what she used. I think it was NVivo 7 in those days, or NVivo 5. I can't remember. Yeah, the blue screen. I remember NVivo. Yeah, that's what we used. And it's a question of formatting the data and getting the data in the right way. It was NVivo as well that after 3 hours told us that women were pregnant. But yeah.
Well, as you say, it's really a question of getting the data in. And it's not just, I think it's not just the data. A lot of it also may be the metadata that attached to it. All within the law RDBMS. And Vivo, at least when I've used it, seems quite strong with, you know, working through connections between these semantic triplets. I think the metadata is probably also critical.
So how much is an NVivo license now? Because I think she paid about £80 for a year as a student.
It's probably somewhere in that ballpark still. I think it was like $120. You know, for a license. They offer, you know, if you need 6 licenses, you know, you can negotiate. It's manageable.
So if we took her PhD questions and reformatted them and used that as a basis so that we had some degree of consistency with the existing data, we could then send our ASSAP members to collect more data on the same framework, which would give us a larger. And once we had a larger sample, we could have far more robust discoveries, hopefully. I mean, the word discoveries. Yeah, I'll send you a copy of her PhD anyway, or I'll ask her to, actually, because that'd be more polite than just handing out my girlfriend's PhD. But yeah, I'll send it over and you can have a look. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, Caroline, over to you. Questions for Gary?
Other questions?
Yeah,
sorry,
thank you. Sorry, listening to what you were saying, Gary, it's interesting to hear that our team are on the right track with the qualitative and quantitative data that we would take while at our investigations, private and also ones that were called in to do events. I've also got 4.5 years of data that I've taken for my haunted house that I'm currently living in. So if you'd like to have a play with the data on that, you're very welcome, and see what you can make with it. I've got it all in a Word format, so it's not logged into Excel or anything, unfortunately. But listening to what CJ was saying about temperature not dropping, I totally agree with that when we go to investigate somewhere. But what we have found is that atmospheric pressure changes. So I've got some top of the range equipment in the house that measures all the data for the atmosphere and things like that. So when we have an event or an activity in the house, I go back and see if I can correlate that as well. So it kind of links up where you get a pressure drop.
See, that's the kind of metadata that could prove to be so important, because it could also influence how we invest in future investigations. Focus on things that appear to make sense.
Yeah. Happy to have a chat another time. If you need any more of my data to play with, I'm absolutely happy with that. But going back to your presentation, Inska, she said that quantitative analysis book that you flipped up, it wasn't on the screen long enough. So is it any chance that you could probably let us have the information on that one, please?
I'll put it right into the chat. Do that right now.
Wonderful, thank you. I guess it's one that still can be bought on Amazon or good bookshops.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'll put the author's name in. It's pretty widely available still.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, moving down to questions or comments. Kieran Farrell said, I remember having various discussions with the Rhines about this sort of thing back in the early 1970s. The difficulty was that the phenomena that I and others were experiencing at boarding school did not fit into the boxes they had devised. One of the reasons for this is that in order to create a case in their database for analysis, then both investigator, experiencer, and witnesses had to agree about the nature and technical description of the phenomena. In the end, they simply called my case one of a poltergeist and didn't know what else to call it, and a data card was filled out. I don't think a lot has changed, though, Gary, over the years, because if I get one of these cases that come up, I don't always assign it ghost or poltergeist. And if anybody who has been doing this a long time and has this high-end activity, do you not find that it comes as a multi-level as well? That it could be more than one thing? If you've got poltergeist activity, it tends to come alongside of other activity.
I believe that's true. Part of, I think, one of the benefits of doing this work, not just be to look at correlations, but it will be to define perhaps more crisply what some of these phenomena are. There is a general consensus as to what a poltergeist is, general, but what other, a lot of other phenomena are just tossed in under the generic term ghost, and perhaps one of the things that would come out of this is to try to determine are there other categories within the ghost class that perhaps we need to describe using a specific term. Right? So, right? And so that way, when there were multiple phenomena, we're in a position to say, you have this, you have that, you have this, and it's actually a meaningful term recognized by at least a community of people practicing in it. Hopefully that made sense.
I like the expression complex haunting. a complex haunting. So that tends to cover all avenues.
Yeah, no, it sometimes can be very complex when you have multiple phenomena occurring. I do think that when we are gathering narrative data, it's it can sometimes be perhaps more when you're trying to build a narrative, you're weaving a story. In part, what I'd like to try to do through this is actually take the bits and pieces out of that, right? Almost like method time motion study. Walk in this room, you make a left, you make a right. This happens, that happens. A series of narrative steps rather than a single narration. So we're not making any assumptions. All we're doing is we're breaking it into narrative steps to see if those narrative steps repeat elsewhere. The pattern. Am I making myself clear?
You are. There's just so many questions that my brain has to ask. I think it probably could do with another talk entirely just based on that on itself. So it is a very complex subject when you start breaking into each of the details minutely.
Absolutely. And it is hard to do. But in part, as even with the Churchill exam, not a whole lot of information, but there are 3 or 4 things you can get out of that, and a lot of metadata you can wrap around it. It's I think within the narration are the patterns we're looking for.
And I agree with you as well. What we've been finding in some of the events that we've gone to or investigations, the weather has a massive effect on some of the activity. Not just thunder and lightning, which is the atypical haunting films that you get in the horrors, but we're talking wind. Yep. When you get a wind that whips up from nowhere, that increases activity. And when you ask your household, please can you log the time, who was with you, the weather outside, they look at you and their head tilts to one side and they go, weather? Well, what's that got to do with anything? And you'd be surprised. Just can you log the weather? So it's one of those kind of little things that they don't understand until you start showing them the data when it comes back that you have these links with weather phenomena and pressure drops.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that the weather would have a key factor, and that may explain if it's a real phenomenon. If there's something physical at work here, perhaps why temperatures are not affected because it's pulling energy from somewhere else. I'm assuming that if it's real, it's either energy or matter. Can't be neither.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be interesting to see the plotted graph for some of the cases I've got. I think I might go and get this software that you've mentioned. But thank you for that. Going down, thanks on the list. Colin Blisden says, thank you for the talk. Dave, I don't know what Dave's last name is, apologies. Defining a standardized question set to create the core data source would be a great start. Good geospatial awareness would be good to overlay. Gary, $100 million question. Have you got a book?
Do I have a book? No.
Maybe we should encourage you to have a book where you could define these questions.
I think we should encourage Gary to run a research project because this is something we're doing, definitely. And I'm quite happy to pay for NVivo licenses now. I'll just wait for Gary to get back. In 1994, the Cheltenham Psychic Research Group created the spontaneous cases paperwork sample, which was designed to be a standardly defined questionnaire to be used on spontaneous cases by the SPR and other groups throughout Britain. It was done by Derek Newman and Harry Lurwell. And I took it out to test it. And while we were testing it, one of the things we go was with section 6A, I think it was have you had percussive phenomena? Yes. So was it a bang, a rap, or a knock? What? Yeah. What's the difference? How do I know the difference between a bang, a rap, and a knock? It was
and like, a tap. And a tap. Don't forget a tap.
Yeah, and so on. And it was just that it became so ridiculous because they hadn't actually defined these terms yet. They created and
right.
It was laughed out. I mean, Tony Cornell threw it out basically, and there was also some kind of personality test involved, a psychometric test. I don't even believe in psychometric tests. And Sue Blackmore said, "Well, what evidence is it based on? How was it designed?" And I looked at it and said, "Actually, it's one that I made to try and convince my girlfriend that she should really spend more money on me." And it bears no resemblance whatsoever to anything scientific ever. It was, one of my half-witted seduction attempts of the time. And I think you'll find that this isn't actually so much a psychometric test as a attempt to wind up Nicola, my girlfriend of the time. But anyway, yeah. So, yeah, the CPRG, and they just picked it up and included it. So the CPRG case paperwork sample is an example of how not to do it, which is why we need data professionals who actually know what they're talking about, like Gary, to run the project rather than game show host. Gary, do you have the time to run a project? Yes. Excellent.
I have to think about it. Thank you.
So if we pay for the license...
I should have the time.
Well, if we got together a group of people, I mean, is Richard Perry still here? Rich, you're a data professional, aren't you?
Let's do it that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's still here. Richard, did you want to unmute yourself? I've tried to ask him to unmute.
Yeah, that's okay. There's a load of us who've worked with data over the years who would be willing to take part in a project like this and would be fascinating. One of the other projects that we're putting together at the moment, which is going to be run by D-Sister, Jackie? Yeah, D-Sister anyway, is definitely going to be running it, is the Big Cat project. And that is going to be really important because there's so many big cat sightings across the UK every year. And this is exactly the kind of database we need there, where we can record the sighting, we can record the information, and we can try and pick up if there is some kind of pattern and try and identify what's happening with sightings of large black cats or large tigers or lions or whatever else in the English countryside. Because, yep.
Did Gary disappear off to go and find this list for Dave? Maybe we can come back to it. We can put it in the chat afterwards if it's easier for you.
Yeah, let's try and get Gary back.
We're not that scary that he's done a runner. There we go.
Bled from the data. Yes. No, come back, Gary. We'll put it in afterwards, yeah? So we were saying the big cat sightings are another area where we're very keen to create a database and to have an analysis of the data, to see if they cluster in certain areas, to see if they cluster where there's population, to see if they are clustering on certain types of terrain, certain weather conditions, because, are they real animals that are being seen, or are they, something else? Are they just large black domestic moggies? Who knows? But it's the kind of subject where we've got a project coming up, and Bobby, that's right, Bobby's going to run it, Dee's sister. She's going to be, attempting to try and find out. So, yeah, and we need analysts. We need people who can use data and are willing to do it. I mean, if you saw this creature bounding across a field, on a dark day, a rainy day, you could think that it was some kind of giant monster, couldn't you? Whereas, in fact, it is just a domestic idiot moggy. There you go. You have to come along and be a nuisance now because your brother's not here anymore. There you go. So, right, sorry, back to you.
Back to the questions and the comments. So Barry Cooper has just mentioned Charles McCreary. I don't know if that means anything to you.
Yeah, that's the surname of Charles, whose name I couldn't remember.
Okay,
Charles
that's fine.
McCreary and Celia Green ran a rather wonderful little research project in late 60s, early 70s. And Celia and Charles are both very odd people in a sort of very intelligent, highly intelligent, highly eccentric kind of way. Apparitions is their classic book. I think it was published in 73.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In case anybody hasn't seen Gary, he put the book Quantitative Narrative Analysis by Franz. So I think that's how you say it, Franosi. So that's in the comments if anybody wanted to go back later when it was to get the book. Bill, rather than me ask your question, do you want to unmute yourself and say your comment that you did?
Yes, some years ago, ASSAP promoted Project Traffic Light, which was an attempt to build up a large amount of categorized data about spontaneous phenomena. However, as with so many ASSAP initiatives, it fell by the wayside after a short time. ASSAP is good at coming up with ideas for initiatives, but once members realise that actual work is involved, people disappear in puffs of smoke, which is a great shame, of course.
This is where PhD students come in handy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's an excellent point. And I do think there's a lot to be said for getting some PhD students whose doctorate depends on it. Because they would be very self-motivated. The rest of us have lives.
Yeah.
Sometimes it gets in the way.
I'm sure, though, we can find amongst the members people who'd like to get involved in a project. And if it's not all down to one person, I'm sure that people would be happy to give time and effort to support for this. I mean, it's something that's very valued and needed within the investigation side of the paranormal.
The goal would eventually be to make this database available so that people could continue to input stories in, content in going forward, so that it becomes evergreen, right? That a century from now, even though it would evolve, we have created a base on which people could then build going forward.
Yeah.
Thinking big.
Well, it's important because it justifies our existence. I mean, we need to do something. And that's why I'm very keen on launching projects and publishing the journal and getting conferences occurring again. Because at the end of the day, we should be contributing to a body of knowledge and going forwards and making progress. And, it's depressing when you find yourself debating points that were being debated in 1894 and we're not one iota further forwards. So I think there has been a huge amount of progress. I think there's a lot of progress at the moment on poltergeist in the UK. But, there are other areas where we're not making much progress, and using some kind of analytical framework, if we've got people who understand how to use analytical frameworks, because garbage in, garbage out is the problem.
Absolutely.
Talking about Rich helping with the statistics, he said, sorry, his audio is not working. Yes, he is a statistician in the Office for National Statistics. So there you go. If we can get Rich on board, then we're on a winner. Dave, I don't know Dave's last name again. Dave said, I've got 30 years of data analytics in insurance, definitely interested in being involved. And then Tony Hayes, I know that he set up his own software, but I don't know how he would feel about talking to people about this. But he's plotted some of the things that we've worked with together and had some really good outcomes on the graphs to show correlation between dates and times and activity. And he looks at the minute data as in, is it a knock, a tap, a bang, a rap? So he breaks it down to the minute, as I do with the type of information that goes in. So, Tony, I don't know if you've just seen that. Gary's just put the data analysis software in a link for you as well. That's all the questions we have. But is there anybody who would like to ask Gary something?
I've got one for Gary.
Okay.
In fact, for anyone, what are 5 questions that we could that might be resolvable using using the data sets? So let's say we collected a whole load of data. What kind of things could we look for? So I know that this is an exercise in grounded theory and bottom up, so we shouldn't actually have research questions, but what are the kind of research questions it could answer? I mean, the first thing I thought was, do ghosts walk through walls? Are ghosts associated with, do they show conscious awareness of the witness? Those are 2 very important questions. Are ghosts associated with a certain time of day or night? Is there a certain type of percipient who experiences them? But just give me a few examples of classic questions where we might actually benefit from data and how the data would work there.
I mean, you mentioned quite a few of them. Right? I think awareness is an important one. I think the information about the witness. Sorry. Is there a correlation between education and seeing ghosts? Is there a gender difference? Right? Are women or men more likely to see ghosts? The use of right, or to experience a phenomena? Right? It sounds like there's already been work done on the time of the day, but there are an awful lot of anniversary ghosts. Are there patterns involved when there's a phenomena that occurs in the same location? Is there a pattern to it that we may not see? Are there geographic patterns so that when something occurs in one area, does that mean that a mile down the road is more likely to be an occurrence, more likely than perhaps 50 miles down the road? Right? Is there something in the geography? I mean, these are all things that with a good set of data, I think we could answer. Or at least start approaching an answer.
Back in '94. I tried to record as many as I could, specific times in which encounters occurred, when we knew the exact time throughout 94, 95, 96. And the reason was that I discovered that the Heartland Geomagnetic Monitoring Station down in Devon were willing to give me accurate to the minute readings on the Earth's magnetic field. So I could get the fluctuations on what was happening to the EMF across the globe. And because we were able to look at local trends using the, in UK data down to minutes, etc., the question was whether the Persinger-Lafreniere field fluctuation hypothesis would be borne out, whether there was a relationship between, what was happening to the Earth's magnetic field and the psi phenomena. So that's the kind of thing we can do with large data. There's huge amounts of scientific data that's easily and readily available. Now, that was in the 90s when we only had email. And we just got the data sets emailed to us on spreadsheets. But nowadays, you imagine how much with real-time data analysis we can actually. Now, the problem is that we might find spurious things like the famous link between pirates and global warming. But, correlation is not necessarily causality. It might not be. It might not be that ice cream sales are driving the temperature up. It might be the other way around, and so on. So we're going to have to be careful. But it sounds like a fascinating set of experiments and something we need to do. So you definitely think we should do this. And I think everyone here is enthusiastic about going out there and collecting real data, aren't they? So perhaps we need a data officer. So data officers we deal with the security of data rather than the analysis of it. Maybe we need an analyst. There you go, Gary. So what's stage one?
Well, stage one would still be, pulling together a team to prepare some sort of a proposal to actually, write out, the research questions and a more detailed approach. That would be phase one.
Well, you've got a supportive chair because I'm the chair and I'm supportive. So And I'm pretty sure that the exec will do it. So if you'd like to go ahead and start that process, and if anyone would like to volunteer and write to you, where could they get in touch with you, Gary?
I'll put my email in the chat. We go.
While
Just
Gary's putting his email in the chat, Jackie Tonks has said, in terms of big cat data, she knows a guy from the Forest of Dean who has an extensive database of big cat sightings.
Yeah.
He's
Is that
keen
Frank?
to share things.
Yeah, Frank Tunbridge. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was Frank. Yep, Frank's cool. John Kane's got a question for Gary. John, would you like to ask it directly, or? John's asking about experiences in childhood. Is John got a microphone?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
yes,
Can you hear me?
Yep. Yep.
yes, we can.
It was just a comment on what questions to put on the questionnaire for qualitative data. I was thinking about asking people about if they'd had experiences in childhood. That was all.
If we want to examine connections by age, we certainly can't discount, children. I mean, poltergeist phenomena, my understanding, has a very close connection to children in their early adolescence, and so
There's a paper I did. It's actually just an article called "Sex and the Unmarried Poltergeist," which is in one of the Seriously Strange about 4 or 5 years back, in which I argue that statistically there's no link between women, adolescent women, and poltergeists, that they are actually, the data suggests that they are evenly distributed by gender. And I look at the way the idea might have developed through the work of Nandor Fodor and then Philip Aim and Isaac Bonewitz, who very much popularized that idea with D. Scott Rogo in the late 70s, early 80s. So,
Well,
okay,
young woman
good to know.
played a lot back in the 70s, so I'm not surprised.
I always thought that the reason that, sexually frustrated young women were poltergeists is because most psychical researchers were aging, unattractive men. So who couldn't get girlfriends. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Rich Kirby's got a question. Let's go for it. Rich. Caroline, I think you're going to have to read this one out but thank you ever so much to Gary. I will shut up. And
I can't see it.
Can you see Rick's?
No,
Rick's question. Oh, it's a direct. No, it's all right. It's a direct message to me in which he's asking a large number of things about something else. So, but thank you very much. That's been a wonderful talk. I think that this is something that we're all very excited about, and everyone thinks we should get on with. So, if you're interested in getting involved, Gary's details are in the chat at the moment. And also, if you email me, I will be very happy to put you in touch. So thank you to everyone for coming tonight. And thank you to Gary for one of the most challenging, interesting and productive talks we've had in the last 2 years. That is wonderful. And I'm just going to look at NVivo and see what we're up to now. Accept all. It was getting better. I think NVivo 3 I used. Yeah. So we've still got a load of data from Becky's PhD. She's still got all the data in the NVivo format. So it doesn't even need, the coding would need to be checked to make sure it's actually sensible, because obviously she's not a data scientist, but it is a huge amount of data that's already ready to go in the NVivo proprietary format.
Great. Look, I will look forward, to hearing from people, and I'll be happy to try to keep things moving along.
Bill's got a response as well, so should we just go back to Bill, and then we better let Gary escape.
Bill said, to address John Kane's point, if we're going to build up this database from an existing source, e.g. books and investigation reports, it's too late to add questions for the witness. All we can enter into that part is what's already been documented.
Very
I
true.
don't know.
And
Well, we can start a new database. We can add data to it. I mean, we can add categories as we go, can't we? One of the problems we had
yeah,
is that sometimes when you're recording data nowadays, you have to give the person the option of opting out, but you also have to be very clear about how the data will be used. So we provided data in aggregate, not an individual. How would we deal with questions of that?
Yeah, that's how we do it in Treasury as well, right? To ensure that the privacy is protected.
Yeah.
In terms of a questionnaire, I at some point, hopefully, as we develop our data model, it will help us develop a questionnaire that will then meet the needs of the database. It should be a back and forth. Right? As we work through the data model, we'll identify information we will seek from the questionnaire, and as information comes in from the questionnaire, we'll identify if there are any gaps as we go, or if there are any definitions that we have to tighten down using that bang graph example. Right? So I see this as a feedback loop, moving things as we move forward.
Yeah, it's one of the things about it is that you've got the capacity to expand your questions and to change and to create directed inquiries as you go, because it's a grounded theory. You're not starting off like in science where you created a hypothesis and you're testing it, and therefore it becomes illegitimate to change the goalposts, because the goalposts are emerging from the data. So when you start with this kind of data, this is the ideal approach to take, which is why I focused on it so much. So yeah, fantastic, brilliant. Well, thank you very much to Gary for a truly challenging, interesting, and positive step forward. And I look forward to seeing what is developed. We'll look forward to funding some work in this area. If we can start to put together the ideas now, then just come to us when you're ready, and we can begin as soon as you're ready. So thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome, and again, thank everyone for their time.